Welcome to the Gems Podcast with Shom, where we celebrate hidden gems and give them their shine. We dive into lesser-known music, rare records, vinyl culture, and the worlds of jazz, funk, soul, rare grooves, and international heat. This is for all you music lovers, sample hunters, beat diggers, e-diggers, and musical world travelers. I'm Shom, a longtime record collector, music lover, and music researcher who discovered music in reverse. I started off as a huge hip-hop fan, tracing breakbeats and samples through jazz, funk, soul, psych rock, and everything in between. Digging is really endless, and I've always been fascinated by the context, history, and characters behind the music. Some of you may be music experts, OGs who've been in the game for years. Others may be newer and learning, but that's all good. As for me, I'm forever a student. Today's guest is DJ Pari, a global crate digger, DJ, producer, filmmaker, and radio host who's made a name for himself DJing around the world. Thanks for joining me, brother.
Hey, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
I found your work on the internet, on social media. I really loved it. The way you profile records, you share a little bit about them, and I learn a lot from your taste. I'm always a student. I especially enjoy the world of jazz, specifically spiritual jazz, modal jazz, and I learn a lot from you. And I'm really educated by it. How did you really, what are your origins in terms of developing your sound and your ear?
Well, it's actually a very unusual story. Really, the way I was born and raised in Germany, in a mid-sized town in Germany with parents who were really unmusical, had no specific taste. So I didn't really get a musical education at home, but I became a Prince fan quite early, back in the late 80s, and became quite obsessed with him, and would follow him around and, check out all the shows. And I had a little bootlegging enterprise that I ran out of my parents' house, where I sold, previously unreleased recordings, live recordings, stuff you definitely shouldn't do as a teenager because it is a small criminal enterprise. But it definitely made me, meet a lot of people who are also Prince fans, who are music fans. And I made a circle of friends when I was just 15 who were in their early 20s. They were already in college. And they invited me in their circle because I was a Prince fan and I had all this music that they didn't have access to. So they educated me in return with music that just had started coming to Germany from England called acid jazz. This movement. It's really not a musical genre, but more like a mix of 70s jazz, 60s blue note sound with hip hop, house. So really not, in a sense, very original music, but branded really well, that really blew up in Europe in the early 90s and then spilled into Germany as well. And that's how really was my first taste of jazz. That's what piqued my curiosity in jazz.
I love the bootlegging part of it. It sounds wild today, but I understand that activity thinking back then. Also, the world of acid jazz was, I think, a gateway for a lot of people. I remember hearing it, I was quite young, and some of the influences around me played me this music, told me about this movement in Europe, specifically in the UK, and it developed my ear as well. Even artists that essentially became pop artists from the acid jazz world, Jamiroquai and others, brand new heavies, great groups, really were a gateway drug for me too. Your writing and the way you describe things is full of passion, introspection, and information itself, and I really enjoy it. I think you're a compelling storyteller. How did you develop your way of communicating?
Well, I'm in my other life, I'm a journalist, and so I write for a living. It's a passion of mine, but so there's not a lot of room for creative writing. So that's why I found Instagram. I went to Instagram about 8 years ago now and started that account, not really to promote my DJ brand, but really just to promote records that I was listening to. And it's really just a creative outlet, to be honest. And I found there's a really great community out there. I made lots of new friends, great connections all over the world, and all that, with this mutual interest that everybody shares, and that's jazz records. And it has really become a especially during the pandemic, I would say, in the first couple of years when everything was still shut down, people had nowhere to go. They had all this money to spend, on jazz records, and so when this really developed into this marketplace, not just for selling and trading and buying, but also just for exchanging information and forming friendships and new connections. And sometimes it can get become like a chore to come up with new posts and write about, and sometimes you revisit an album that you've already posted years before, and just get a new take on it and see how you feel about it now, because tastes change, they evolve all the time. And it's really just become a fun outlet for me to share my passion for jazz with others.
There's a few things that you mentioned that I wanted to revisit. The fact that you are a journalist, I think, is really commendable. There's an intellectual element to that. Being a writer, I'm sure you're a very well-read person, in addition to music. I've done my share of writing in my life as a filmmaker, screenplay writer. Reading, it enhances my ability to articulate myself, and I can see that the way you discuss jazz. I'll also say there's artists that you talk about that I think you mentioned taste change. My taste has evolved quite a bit over time. In my earlier days, I learned about this music, about jazz, about soul, about funk, through hip-hop, going backwards. Maybe it's a generational thing. Hip-hop is typically, it's always 4/4 time. And not all jazz is 4/4 time. And through sites like yours, through work like yours, learning about Hank Mobley, Eric Dolphy, Joe Henderson, Woody Shaw, and even Coltrane. I've always known about him. But in my, let's say, more recent years, it's elevated my life tremendously, especially John Coltrane. I would say changed my mentality, continues to do that, because it's so out there, mentally, right? So I really appreciate what you're doing. I think it helps other people too.
I had to kind of, add to that, because you said it changed your life. I think that's what a lot of people find with Coltrane. I have obviously, like yourself, listened to thousands of records in your life, but I still remember the very first time I heard A Love Supreme, and I was 19 years old, and one of my best friends in LA played it for me, and he actually gave me his copy that night, and it was just life-changing to me. I just had no idea that this was actually possible, that a human being, an artist, can reach such a level of intellectual honesty and creativity that he's willing to share with the rest of us who don't have access to the same type of genius. Was a very selfless thing for Coltrane to do, and he has changed lives, and you and I were just, two among quite many people who have been rocked by the sound of John Coltrane and by his work and by his music.
I couldn't agree more. I think the way you phrase it is fantastic. As you might be aware, for our audience, not only is John Coltrane a fantastic genius musician, jazz artist, this impact that we're talking about, there are literally churches of John Coltrane. This is not me using a turn of phrase. You can look it up. There's a church of John Coltrane. It unlocks something for people that is just more than music. So it's great that we could talk about these things together. I know we kind of got into our conversation. I introduced you briefly. For our audience, can you explain a little bit about what you do and more about yourself?
Like I said earlier, I've always been in just kind of two different realms of careers. On one side, journalism, and the other side, music business. Music business had always been to me a side hustle, except for my early years, and sometime during the early 2000s when I went full-time, when I founded my organization called Soulpower, which was a booking agency, event production agency, music production agency. We did artist management, so we basically carried a brand around the world with different soul and funk legends that we worked with. Never really with jazz artists during that time. That was really more of a soul R&B thing, but that's really where I did most of my work in music. So jazz for me is really more of a passion that I follow, because obviously there's not really a lot of money to be made in that. You really need to love the music. And I kind of somewhat retired from being a soul and funk DJ about 5-6 years ago. So now when I just play jazz, and that obviously limits your market. A lot of times I reach out to my connections in Europe or Japan and like, hey, I'm coming over. You guys get any gigs? They're like, are you going to play jazz or are you going to play soul? And when I say I'm bringing jazz, they're like, well, we'll bring you back when you play some soul and funk again. So there's unfortunately, and here in the U.S., it all blends very well together, but overseas it's very separated musically. And I'm not really into that in that regard. I just like to play whatever sounds good, whatever feels good at that moment. But yeah, that's basically in a nutshell. I've always been someone who has been supporting artists who are never been really in the spotlight. Like when we discussed earlier before this conversation, we talked about Marva Whitney or Lynn Collins, Gwen McCrae. They were all stars in their own right. They've been sampled many times. Everybody knows these songs, but they've never really been in the spotlight. And so I made my mission early on to kind of bring these ladies and also, other groups like The Impressions back into the spotlight and give them basically a final good 10 years of their careers that we had with them, and before they then retired, and most of them have passed away since.
I think that's really commendable. It's hard to understand the context of how famous or popular or successful or financially successful someone is going backwards. To me, the Impressions are a great band. I mean, they're an extension of Curtis Mayfield and many great songs, and it seems to me like they're sampled quite a bit. I don't know if that makes someone financially well off or not. I have no idea. I kind of don't want to know, right? But it is really commendable that you're looking to provide a spotlight for these artists, these great artists.
Yeah, it was really, to me, I always just consider myself a fan foremost. So I was just in the position where I was able to help them do this, and my personal gain from that was I was around a lot of great music, so and got to see the world in the same context, travel around the world and just taking this music around the world, introducing it to people, and also find out where, in some places where these artists are absolutely, revered, like a guy like Leroy Hutson, who was on Curtis Mayfield's Tom label in the 1970s, who wrote Together with Donny Hathaway, who was Curtis's replacement initially in the Impressions. He's pretty much unknown here in the States, unless you're a real soul music connoisseur. But he's a star in England. Everybody knows him in England. And when we, took him on the road in England, we would have sold out venues. And or the Impressions, for example, they had never in their entire 60-year career, they had never performed in Japan. So we took them to Japan. That was the final tour. And there was people there in the audience. There was young people. There was people our age. There was people who were in the 70s who have been fans since the 1960s and who were in tears because they never thought they would, get to see the Impressions in their lives. So that was just all a very rewarding experience.
I think that's phenomenal. And there's an interesting pattern that you've lived that I'm just observing. When you think about, let's say, modal jazz, bebop jazz, stuff that's popular or being made in the late 50s, early 60s in the U.S., Miles Davis, John Coltrane, that kind of constellation of people around them, that wasn't popular in the 70s and 80s in the U.S., or at least that sound. But they seem to be doing European festivals. I mean, maybe 5 years later or 10 years later. And great recordings in France and Sweden. And it's almost like there's a bit of a delay, right? A group might be popular in the US, and maybe 5 years later, maybe 10 years later, they're getting popular in Europe, and similarly in Japan. And yeah, I mean, you've witnessed that very closely.
Yeah, that's interesting, especially with jazz, because, in America, it wasn't even considered an art form for, during the most creative period of jazz, or what I would consider, from the beginning of modern jazz in the 1940s through the hard bop era to the soul jazz era. None of that was, popular over here. These artists played small dive bars, but when they went to Europe, they played big concert halls and opera houses. And so it's always been, for these artists, a struggle to make a living, not just on the creative side, but also dealing with obviously the Jim Crow system still there, and it's very much intact. And then go to Europe and you're being celebrated as a star. It's very surreal for a lot of these artists. And in soul and funk, there was somewhat a delay in that, but it was more popular music than jazz was initially. So um, I wouldn't call this as extreme of a contrast, but definitely, there's a lot of artists who are just completely unknown here in the U.S. who have been recording here for decades, and they're only being celebrated in Europe or Japan.
That's so interesting. You've been so close to it, working with these artists kind of under your Soulpower label. And it's a unique perspective that you're providing. I want to go back to your beginnings. You mentioned how you started off in Germany. Tell us a little bit about the places you've lived and how it's impacted you, whether it's musically or otherwise.
Well, I mean, like I said, I grew up in a mid-sized town of 250,000 that's like literally half an hour from the Eastern German border at the time. So it was pretty much in the middle of nowhere, beautiful town. I'm not gonna knock it, but it really wasn't the place where you were exposed to music like that. So I really had to go out and find it myself. And like I said, Prince was a very big influence because this was a guy who was dabbling in all sorts of musical genres, and I was never really the biggest fan of his more, popish sounds or the rock stuff. I always gravitated towards the funk and, this jazzier side. And you'd see friends and he would always record his own material, but during the shows he would tap into, playing James Brown or Aretha Franklin. And at some point, my young mind was thinking to myself, well, if my hero Prince respects James Brown so much that he consistently covers his music in his shows, maybe I should check out James Brown, and that's how it really then started to come together for me musically. And that's when I made the decision that I wanted to move to the States to study the music. So I told my parents I was going to go to college in the US, and I moved to Phoenix, Arizona, out of all places. But then quickly, jumped to LA, and quit school and just did music full time for some time, living in LA. And when I went to college, though, in Phoenix, I took jazz history and analysis for 2 semesters, and that class really was an eye opener because for the first time, I'm not a musician myself. I learned some basic in the studio, like basic piano. I played saxophone for a little bit. I played drums in a hard rock band when I was 13 in high school. But none of that was really serious exploration of music. So for me, it was eye-opening to study jazz in university and to really be able to describe what you were listening to, understand and describe what you're listening to. And that goes back to, record reviews on Instagram. You need to actually know what you're writing about. So in that regard, it was very helpful, and I had an amazing professor who was very supportive of my curiosity and interest in jazz that went way beyond his class. And so it wasn't just, understanding how the music works and what you're actually listening to, but then also getting the whole background. Listening to Louis Armstrong as Hot 5, Hot 7, Fletcher Henderson, Count Basie, Duke Ellington. This is music that I'm not necessarily listening to today, but I absolutely appreciate the absolute importance of this music that really laid the foundation for the music that we love in jazz today, or be it even hip hop, So that was really an eye and ear opening experience for me to have the privilege to learn about all that.
That makes a lot of sense, talking about some of the ways you've learned not only about music, but storytelling as a whole. Understanding the history gives that context to understand the nuances and really tell the story in a new way. When it comes to the topic of storytelling, you're also a filmmaker. Under your Soulpower brand, you've had a documentary, The Power of Soul. Tell us more about what inspired that, and what was the story you wanted to tell?
Well, I have to say, I definitely wouldn't call myself a filmmaker because this was the only film that I ever produced. It was actually when I started my Soulpower organization, I had a couple of friends from Germany who are professional filmmakers, independent filmmakers. And they were like, man, they were also music guys. They actually, one of the guys was part of a German hip hop band that was pretty big over in Germany in the early 90s. And he was like, this is actually an interesting story about you, this German DJ who works with all these American funk legends and brings them back in the spotlight. So why don't we do a documentary, just kind of tag along and you interview the artists? And I said, hey, that's, I'm down. So that's how we started with the Power of Soul. But then everybody that I worked with at the time, all the artists, they all came out of the James Brown camp. Like I said, Marvel Whitney, Lynn Collins, Bobby Bird, Vicki Anderson. So we decided at some point we needed James Brown as well for this documentary. And I had worked with him on and off in the late 90s. I played at a bunch of his shows and was friends with a lot of the band, traveled with him in the late 90s in Germany. And so I knew him and I reached out, and he, to my surprise, agreed to give us a 2-hour exclusive interview in his hotel room in Antwerp, Belgium, where he had just finished a 4 weeks run at the Night of the Proms, which is like one of the biggest music festivals in Europe. And he was in a really good mood. And we sat in his hotel suite behind the piano. His wife was there, and got an in-depth interview about how he created the funk, what influenced him. And it was really the most widest-ranging interview his manager later told me that he had done in about 20 years. So, and with that in our hands, and then all the other interviews, we were able to tell, instead of telling a story about this German DJ touring with these funk legends, it really turned into a documentary about James Brown and how James Brown has influenced modern contemporary music, including hip hop. So we had, artists like Curtis Blow in it as well, and The Far Side that we interviewed. So really trying to tie the whole story together and tell a story. And the documentary, it took us about 7 years to work on it. And we premiered it at the Cannes Film Festival in France back in 2013. And then it was on Netflix for a couple of years over in Europe. Unfortunately, never in the US because the James Brown estate was in legal limbo. And it just, it was just not, it didn't work out with the copyright laws. So, but yeah, so we did that documentary. It was a one-off for me, and maybe I'll do another one at some point. I always wanted to do a documentary about jazz vinyl collectors. I think that's an interesting topic. I think that would do quite well on Netflix, don't you think?
I think it would.
Yeah.
I think it would. You might have an idea there. There's so many things that you said that I found mind-blowing. The fact that you were in the same room as James Brown, that you spoke to him. I mean, he's held in such a high regard in my mind. The layers of his music, the eras, how prolific he is, it all sounds quite different to me. I mean, what's popular about James Brown and what he is quite different. His music is very deep at times. It's also party music too, both. And the fact that you got to spend that time with him, it's hard to put into words. He's a legend, and that's not saying enough, right? He formed a lot of the music that exists today.
Yeah, we were really lucky that he was in an excellent mood that day. It could have turned sideways, but it didn't. And to watch him sit behind the piano, baby grand piano in his hotel room, and explain how he came up with the one and funk and how that changed the dynamics of music and the way people not just listen to music but dance to music. And I had to stretch myself sometimes during that interview, thinking like, is this really happening? And we were just treading careful to not ask provocative questions that might take them off or anything, but everything worked out fine. So we had that in the bag, and if you watch the documentary today, it looks at times a little dated because it's at this point, parts of it are 20 years old. But the music in it and the interview sequences, they will, I think, just hold up pretty well.
I did look for it before this interview. It wasn't easy to find on any of my streaming platforms. Now I have to watch it, considering all you've shared. I think the fact that you made a documentary once and completed it. You mentioned it took 7 years. I know this is epic effort. Being a former filmmaker myself, I know the level of persistence it takes and put it out and distribute it. I mean, that's a whole nother world. I think your idea of profiling jazz vinyl collectors is fantastic. Yeah, I think you might be onto something there.
I mean, you know how people on Netflix, the Netflix audience loves to watch documentaries about people who are obsessed with something, like the Star Trekkies, for example, or, uh, you know, um, I don't know what's out there, but I think for a lot of people, it's completely crazy to think that there's record collectors, instead of buying a reissue for $20, they'll spend $2,000 on an original pressing. And then they may not even really play it because, they don't want to damage it. So there's this whole market, obviously, and it really was something that I thought about during the pandemic, because it got really extreme, and people got really obsessed with it. And I think it has slowed down, and I know Instagram is only one outlet and one channel where this market, or this scene, if you want to call it, plays out, but it's a very influential one, and that goes back to what we discussed earlier about, the change of musical tastes and what you're listening to at a certain time. I've seen that kind of shift away too. Like on Instagram, 5 years ago, you post an original Blue Note album from the 50s or 60s, it would get the most likes and attention and comments. And now people have kind of moved on from that, and now like 70s jazz and spiritual jazz and even fusion, Strata East, Black Jazz label, all these, small independent labels, they've become really much more in demand now. So there's always a change, but I think it'll eventually go back to hard bop as well. So it's always changing, always evolving, and then you have a younger audience stepping in, a new market that labels can tap into, and as we've seen in recent years. So yeah, it's definitely something that I think we will continue to follow for many more years to come. I don't think it was just a brief trend or anything.
I think your perspective is really unique. It's accurate. You have great insight, not only because watching these cycles over time, also the global perspective, seeing how audiences reacted to certain artists at different times. And the part that you mentioned about young people, you're absolutely right. I couldn't agree with that enough. There are labels and music that may be familiar to you and I that we have known since we were children, and we're kind of like, hey, yeah, it's great, but I'm onto something else. These kind of very basic records, let's say Donald Byrd, Places and Spaces, a lot of the Mizell brothers' work, you've probably known about it for years. Same here. Well, there are people discovering that today, this fantastic music, and it sounds new, and they're bringing new life to these great albums. And that's part of what I want to do. Meeting yourself, you give such great context. If I meet many people with different perspectives, we could kind of all enjoy it in our own way.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And it's really interesting how, like, for example, in my case, I discovered jazz through acid jazz. That was my gateway. And then I kind of moved backwards, from acid jazz into fusion from the 70s and jazz funk and then soul jazz. And then I ended up with hard bop, so it's kind of like a backward evolution. And for other people, it's the entire opposite. And I'm still trying to convince myself too that I need to keep an open mind and continue to explore music. For example, about 5-6 years ago, I wasn't really too interested in new jazz that was out there, right? But I think there's a very, very active, very broad market right now of young talent that's out there. Be it from the UK, like Ashley Henry and Yusuf Days, but also more seasoned veterans already that still kind of fall in between there. Is like Robert Glasper. I'm a big Robert Glasper fan. So there's so much still happening in this music, and it continues to evolve. And so I think we also have to always work on refining our tastes. I always struggled with free jazz, even as a Coltrane disciple. Free jazz and avant-garde was something that I really had a hard time with. But even though I'm still not really listening to Albert Ayler, for example, I'm listening to Dolphy, and listen to Pharoah Sanders, So there's so many things you can explore, and your musical tastes never really stop evolving if you keep an open mind. And unfortunately, in jazz, what I've also learned is that there's folks who are just really stuck on a particular sound and era, and they're not interested in anything else. And that's fine too. If that's what makes them happy, I think, in a way, it would make me sad to know that there's so much great music out there that escapes them. But hey, if you're happy just, listening to hard bop all day, more power to you.
I see your point of view. I think part of what I get out of music, and maybe you might feel the same way, is kind of a bit of mental traveling, astral traveling, right? Like Pharaoh Sanders. And I think you don't want that to end. I think educating yourself with music from different eras, different times, new and old, is a part of growing as a person. I don't want to lose that ability to travel mentally, and I think it unlocks a lot about the world if you do so.
Yeah, and it's not, some people listen to music as just entertainment. Some people listen to music when they clean the house. Um, I don't do that because to me, music is always about intent. So when I listen to music, sit down and I actually listen, you know. Um, Sole exception maybe being in the car. When I drive, I like to listen to it as well. And I actually listen to a lot of new jazz in my car, and that's, I get to a lot of new music there that way, and then I look for it on vinyl. But I think it's really about how or what role music plays in your life. And I think that in my particular case, I always connect certain albums or certain songs with a certain era in my life or a certain experience in my life. So it's kind of like you're writing your own soundtrack for your life, or you're creating your own playlist for your life. And when you really are serious about music, that can be a very rewarding experience. So, yeah, but again, power to those folks who are really just using it as entertainment and who are just stuck in one genre or subgenre. It's just not, what I'm interested in these days.
I agree in so many ways. I think, I listen to music in all contexts. Walking around, I go for a morning walk. Every day I listen to music to bring myself up. Generally, it's not for me on the side. It's in the middle. It's a central activity. And I think you feel the same way. It really shapes my mind for the day, and I try to adjust it using music to stay in the zone that I want.
Yeah, it's almost like a musical calibration.
Absolutely. I love that phrasing, musical calibration. You've mentioned so many great artists that you've worked with in different periods of your life. What are some of the artists that you've worked with that people don't talk about enough?
Definitely say Leroy Hutson is one of those artists. As I mentioned earlier, he was Donny Hathaway's roommate at Howard University. They wrote The Ghetto together, and then Donny went off to work for Curtis Mayfield at his newly founded Kratom record label. And when Curtis quit as the lead singer of The Impressions, Donny recommended bringing in Leroy as the replacement. But at that point, Leroy was already working on a lot of his own music. So he stayed with The Impressions just for a little over a year. And then, recorded a series of albums for Kratom Records under his name, but also produced other albums, other artists like Linda Clifford, the Voice of East Harlem, Arnold Blair, and a lot of these artists are very little known in the US, but they have a lot of meaning over in Europe, especially in the UK and in the French soul scenes. So, yeah, I would definitely recommend anybody who's interested in. I always call Leroy's music grown folk soul. It's just a very mature approach to soul. It's very smooth. It's very rich in arrangements and orchestration, and it doesn't have the raw edge that like an Al Green has, for example. It's not church music soul. It's really just grown folk soul. That's what I call it.
Did he produce his own work, or was it produced by Curtis Mayfield?
No, he produced his own work too. Yeah.
I have every record he's ever made. He's fantastic. And I always found him to put it in modern terms, it was pimp music, a lot of it. Like, it was pretty funky. He was a badass and really deep. And the fact that he was sampled many times, I'm sure helps. A lot of big artists have sampled him. And the sound quality of the recordings, it left a bit of space. It wasn't so crunchy as some of the other kind of funk at the time, and he's got a great voice, beautiful voice. The fact that you've worked with him, I find it's like He's a true legend. And I mean, to me, he's a giant. I had no idea how famous he was or was not.
Yeah, and it was, initially hard. I've been a fan of his since the 90s. And when I started my own agency, Soulpower, it took me several years to find him because he actually changed his name to Lee Hutson. And he had moved to Miami. He had lived in Miami since the early 80s. And through some mutual contacts, we finally connected. But then, he's just an artist who's very distrustful of the music business in general because of what he has lived through. And he's also not an artist who's necessarily comfortable performing in front of a large amount of people. He's more of a studio guy. He likes to be by himself, go to the studio and just create music. So it took several years really to get to know each other and for him to learn to trust me. And eventually we made it happen. I think we first connected in 2004, and the first time we took him to the UK, it was in 2010. So it was really 6 years in the making until we finally did it. And it was incredible. The live performance, we did the Vintage at Goodwood Festival in the UK, and we had an entire string section there as well, and it was an whole orchestra. It was beautiful.
That's unbelievable what you're some of the facts that you're sharing. Just the way he talks over music is so hypnotic and so fucking cool.
Yeah.
He is one of the baddest out there.
Yeah, and he just turned 80 years old last month, so he's still in good shape.
I love to hear that. I think it's great that you kind of brought him back into the world, because there is a fan base. I mean, I'm certainly a fan, and there are other people who are discovering this. So it's tremendous.
We deal with him for Acid Jazz Records, which to me was kind of like closing circle, because that's how I started, and I became friends with Eddie Pillar, the founder, the DJ, and the founder of Acid Jazz Records, and he was really keen on getting Leroy signed to Acid Jazz, not as a new artist, but to do some proper official reissues of his catalog. So, and we did that, and Leroy, over long fought court battles, he finally was back in the possession of his masters again. So he was able to license those to Acid Jazz, and they have done a fantastic job over the last 6 years or so to roll out all these albums and reissue them. So all that music is now widely available and available for streaming and everything.
I'm really glad to hear that. I mean, it's always hard to follow the world of publishing as just a fan. I'm really glad he has his masters. I'm sure all the sales of Biggie Smalls records and other groups that have sampled him, I hope it found its way back to him. Some of my favorite hip hop songs of all time have sampled Leroy Hutson. Yeah, so I'm glad to hear you got him some piece of this back. We were discussing your life as a DJ earlier. What's popular, what resonates. In a world of today where everything is accessible, what is the role of a DJ now to you?
It's really interesting because to me it feels like almost everybody is a DJ these days, right? I mean, all it takes is a few records, and a lot of people don't even use vinyl anymore. They use either CDs or just go full-blown digital. I think what really has changed is because everything is so widely available now, and there's really very few hidden secrets left in music that are to discover. Like when I started DJing back in the 90s, DJs were still breaking records, as we call it. You might remember that too. So you discover a rare soul, funk, jazz album, you start playing it out. In the UK, they would go as far as covering the labels so nobody would know what they're actually playing, and you create a demand for a certain album or a certain tune that way. I think those days are pretty much over, unfortunately. Because everything is known, and because so many people are just DJing on the side, but I do think there's this new role that has kind of emerged, and I increasingly find myself more comfortable in that realm. Would be of more like a curator. You give people a musical education. I think also another takeaway from the pandemic was people really don't like to go to clubs anymore as much. So meaning like big dance clubs, big dance floors, loud music, and that's why we've seen this, this emergence of vinyl bars everywhere. And some vinyl bars just have, like the original jazz keys do in Japan, they just have a curator who just puts on a record. They won't consider themselves a DJ. But a lot of those venues actually book DJs now. And I actually enjoy playing those. There's, some in Richmond, there's some in DC, New York City. There's a couple of good ones in Atlanta. I mean, these places are popping up left and right everywhere, and I think that's a different way to learn about the music because people sit down and listen. There's still talk. Obviously, it's not like in Japan where people completely shut up and just drink coffee or whiskey and just listen. But it's a much different environment than the club environment where the music is just making you dance. You're actually really appreciating the art behind the music, and you see DJs play the original records. And that's something that is just becoming more rare now with everybody just going to digital. And that's one thing that I just, I will never do. I mean, I've stuck to vinyl for all this time, and I will continue to play vinyl.
I really respect that. I think it's of a certain era that you came up in, especially when you mentioned the part about covering the labels. I'm familiar with that, and I would bet a lot of our listeners have no idea why someone would do that, or why would anyone want that intention. And I know why, right? There's a lot of reasons why, about DJs having their own sound, having their own records that are hard to replicate. I mean, it goes back to hip-hop culture from the beginning. And I respect it, I understand it, and I would say we're in a different world now, for sure. And there are advantages and disadvantages. I am a vinyl guy. I respect DJ culture. That culture is mostly gone for all the reasons that you've said. And yeah, I think there are new opportunities that you kind of mentioned, right? With vinyl listening bars. It's just a different world with different people absorbing the music in a different way. And there are pluses and minuses to all the eras, right? So I think I could understand all the perspectives. I want to keep rolling. Like, I love listening bars. I love being there. The fact that they're everywhere. I mean, they're not as good as what I would imagine it would be in Japan, which is something I've always been fascinated with. Also, the people playing the music there, sometimes they have no, like they don't know shit. Like they don't have good taste. It just looks like a vinyl bar, but there's no one selecting good music. I mean, there's just has the look of it. But that's fine. That happens as things get popular. I try to find the positivity in it. And just like you, I mean, posting on Instagram, you're translating all your knowledge in a new way. So I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, and honestly, of course, I'm tempted to, I just did my last European trip as a DJ a couple of years ago, and absolutely hated hauling my flight case around. And then you have other DJs who show up with a little, book of CDs, or not even that. So it definitely, it's a lot more convenient these days, but to me it's just part of the fun. I don't enjoy playing music if it's not on record. So
I hear you, and there's a place for you. I think it will become more important over time. Not only the records themselves, the method and the development of your ear and sound. It's not so easy to replace.
To me at this point, DJing is more like every gig that I take comes with a purpose and comes with intent, and I like to have the whole experience then. So I want to have fun. I'm not doing it because I want to get paid, but I want to have fun, and I only have fun when I'm playing records, even if that means hauling them through airport terminals. But it just comes with.
I love that. I think one of the plus sides of what you're describing in the current world of listening bars, the current world of vinyl culture, I think there is a bit of a resurgence. I think there's something there. I mean, maybe it's just me and my preferences. There's something there between whiskey and sitting and listening to music, like seriously listening.
Hey, you just described my, perfect Friday evening. So
that's what I want out of life. I mean, it doesn't take a lot. That conversation with someone, looking at the records themselves, reading the liner notes, this is the highest level of enjoyment to me. And I'm glad you feel the same way. I feel like you're a person who kind of astral travels through music. You take your mind higher through music, so do I. And I think some of our listeners might be the same way. So I find these kind of conversations helps get that idea and that vibe out there, and maybe there'll be more of it.
Yeah, I think, like I said, we definitely seen a resurgence, and there is an interest from the younger generation now. I see in a lot of local listening bars, I see folks in their 20s, and that makes me happy to see.
Yeah, you're totally right. There's always going to be a new generation enjoying this unbelievable music because it's so good, it's timeless. And for maybe you and I to see these cycles, it gives you a unique perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are you working on that brings you energy, that you're excited about? And this could be music related or not. What in life excites you?
It's still the music, but I've really mellowed out. Like I don't work in the music business full time anymore. I hold off and on events in DC, Washington DC, and I'm going back to Europe next month to play some gigs, but it's more like very selective. I'm not going different places anymore just to play or to make money. It's really about where I have a personal connection with a city or with people there, or with a venue there, a club there. I still like to do it. I definitely play. I stick to the jazz side of things now. But not just, like I said earlier, not just 50s and 60s and 70s, but also new stuff and new music that's been released. And sometimes I still throw in some soul and funk, but definitely more on the jazzier side. And if that means I get less work as a DJ, I'm fine with that.
I mean, I think that's an interesting reflection. It's kind of, I don't know, maybe it's a pattern that you're kind of going through and I'm going through, is that where the type of jazz that you share a lot, it's quite introspective. It's deep music. It's maybe not nightclub music. It's not. But it's unbelievable. It has these layers that I've mainly come to appreciate more so than the kind of music I listened to as a teenager, because I'm a different person.
Yeah, and a lot of the music is really not meant for clubs, to listen to. I mean, that's why I'm saying, I wasn't joking when I said earlier that's my perfect Friday evening. I mean, that's what I really love to do, is just sit down, drink some bourbon and just listen with intent. And as long as I can do that, that's what I consider my most important project personally.
Hey, maybe you and I will do that one day when you're in New York City or when I'm in Richmond. Last question, where can people hear more about what you do, find out about what you're putting out?
Really, my Instagram is my only platform these days. I've done away with everything else, and I no longer have my own website. I just didn't see it didn't need it anymore. And, so yeah, Instagram, I'm still active there, and I hope every now and then I'm still gonna work on some music actively. It's been a few years now since I was in the studio, but something might pop up again. You just take it one day at a time.
I'll be listening and looking out for what you're putting out there. I'll be learning more from what you do, and I really appreciate you joining the podcast today.
No, thanks for having me, man. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, brother. Peace.
Peace.